so quickly. So today is Solomon's treasure, because so much I mentioned last week of the wisdom, what's called the wisdom literature in the Old Testament, and it's penned largely by Solomon because of this great gift, because of the prayer that he prayed, that God would grant him wisdom, this wisdom to lead such a great people, the people of God. And so this could have been treasure hunt, right? Or Solomon's mind. I find it interesting that God created us in such a way that we love discovering things. And it's not just the discovery of it. We were talking Friday of the emotional side of the Gospels and the message of God. Our God is a God of passion and great emotion. We're admonished to marshal or control those emotions so they don't rule over us, as we looked at this transition both from Samuel, Eli to Samuel, and then from Saul to David, King Saul to David. We see the contrast of those who don't have the ability to control their emotions or control their self. But this idea of the treasure hunt, we're fascinated from it, even from a young age. I think of, getting the treasure map, right? And the intrigue of it. There's this thrill, of the discovery, but also the anticipation of it, that there's something there, X marks the spot. But here's something interesting, the way we're kind of wired as human beings. We all love to search things out and find things. From a young age, we do a lot of these things, and I love watching the kids, how we entertain kids with this. But as we get older, we have this tendency to resist being taught. It's almost like we don't like being taught, but we love to discover things. But if you try to tell somebody, hey, let me tell you how to do that. Leave me alone. I'm working it out. I always love that image, in the motivational world. There's a guy, he's trying to pick the lock to the treasure chest. And somebody comes up and taps him on the shoulder, and he says, hey, I got the combination. He says, stop bothering me. I'm trying to figure this out. And that's our life. That's our life. But the joy of discovery that God gives us, and then his treasure is unsearchable. We do it, but we'll never exhaust it. We'll never get tired. We might go through cycles. We might think, well, I got it now, but it never ends. I remember I'm a psychology fan, going to school, and I always like that hierarchy of needs, but these plateaus that some of the psychologists would say, you get to a plateau, you work really hard, you set a goal, and then you get it, and then you're like, okay, now what? And so we're constantly setting goals, and that's why, man's never satisfied, but this satisfies. And so from the text, from Solomon's treasure, of course, it's wisdom, but it's all the things that wisdom brings. And we're going to focus in on these treasures. But remember, if you read the wisdom literature, namely Ecclesiastes, you'll find that to a large extent, there's a point in Solomon's life where this wisdom is a burden. The lament is, oh, to be wise in a land of fools. Is it a blessing? I wonder. But look at this. Watch this. From the text, it's in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 31. And it says, for he was wiser than all other men. And then he lists some of these other men. I find this interesting, Alan, for our group that we're going through the 1 John together, that all the background, they put all these names for all these different human philosophies, but they're nothing is new, right? Even back at this time when Solomon has this great wisdom, look at verse 31. He says, for he's wiser than all other men, wiser than Ethan, the Ezrahite, Heman, I don't know if you pronounce it that way, Calcol and Dadra, the sons of Mahal, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. So people did have certain understandings, but what did they do with their understanding? Did they honor God, or did they create these great, what we call philosophies of men, to explain things from my limited perspective rather than accept God's wisdom and God's perspective? And so the wisdom is the treasure, but it comes in these categories that I'll list for you. The first one, I put wisdom in this category of common sense, because we have this ability to recognize things, and we say, oh, that's just common sense, when you kind of work it out. But then the next aspect of it, it's not just getting wisdom or learning some common sense things, but we need to communicate that to others. And as parents, and we have this example in our life structure, as parents, we learn things, and we get to a certain age. We were honoring fathers last week, and I marvel at the different generations. We had a reunion last week, so we have the different generations of fathers. And my brother was commenting about he's helping his son renovate. They're starting out with their new baby, renovating the house. And he's like, oh, my goodness, he's so impressed with the stuff that his son knows. I said, yeah, because he's a dad. He just has to do these things now. But nowadays, it's pretty easy to access information. I always marveled at how my brother knew stuff. He wasn't very mechanical, but he was a dad, and he had to learn this stuff. But we call it common sense, but then we try to communicate that. We try to communicate it to others. And then the third aspect of this wisdom comes in the form of charity, and we'll talk about that. Jesus said in Matthew 6:21, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And in Matthew 12:35, he says, the good person out of the good treasure brings forth good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure brings forth evil, which goes along with David's psalm this morning, Psalm 101, where David has the position of king, but to rid the land of evil. The task that never ends. So Solomon, again, he makes the appeal through Proverbs to his son. In Proverbs 7:1, but it's also earlier, he says, my son, keep my words and treasure up my commandments with you. And so in the Proverbs, in this instruction to the next generation, he also says in Proverbs 15:6, in the house of the righteous there is much treasure, but trouble befalls the income of the wicked. In Proverbs 21:20, precious treasure and oil are in a wise man's dwelling, but a foolish man devours it. And I remember one of the things growing up, it's just one of my favorite fables, right, is the ant and the grasshopper. I never knew it came from Proverbs. Go to the ant, you sluggard. But the ant and the grasshopper. All I remember was the grasshopper, we just wanted to sing and dance and play, and the ant is always busy. He says, and Solomon says, learn from that. Learn from that. Well, anyway, so from this, if we go back up in our text to it starts out, I have a heading in the ESV for 1 Kings 4, verse 20. It says, Solomon's wealth and wisdom. And so the first thing we notice about Solomon is Solomon received a united kingdom. So Solomon is like the gold star of the king and the kingdom, this united kingdom. And we talked about that as David ultimately receives the kingdom from Saul and then brings it together, but it was under Solomon, his son Solomon, that he gets this united kingdom. And it says in verse 20, 1 Kings 4, Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. So if we drop down to verse 29 now, we'll see that, and God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure and breadth of mind like the sand of the seashore. So like I said, that's his wisdom, and it says so in verse 30, like his wisdom surpassed all people's wisdom and all the wisdom of Egypt. And so then he names these names. Now, to us, these names in verse 31 don't seem like much, but I would imagine at their time, we have our equivalents today, our gurus, the people, oh, wow, they're so wise. They give such great counsel. But these philosophies of men, and they offer help in certain circumstances. And sometimes, if we're not careful, what we'll do is we'll say, well, that's good to follow that always. No, God gives this wisdom just like he gives kings for our instruction and for our learning, but ultimately we should grow up and recognize the Father. So that's the first thing about the wisdom comes in the form of common sense. In our study in 1 John, John would say, test the spirits. You know, there's all these philosophies. Paul says in Colossians, right, there's no end to these philosophies of men, and then they have the appearance of wisdom. And they might help you for a time, but they are not going to ultimately save you, okay, from yourself, as it were. So there's this common sense. Jesus said this when Judah was demanding. Jesus says, show us a sign. And Jesus gives them that. It's in Matthew 12. I'm just going to look at 41 and 42, but he says, I'm not giving you a sign. You're an adulterous generation. The only sign I'm going to give you is the sign of Jonah. But he says this in 12:41. He says, the men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And behold, something greater than Jonah is here. And this is where I want to key in on Matthew 12:42. The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. So I would say, not only does God give wisdom, and he gives it freely, and we can pray for wisdom, but in the form of common sense. And Jesus is appealing to, he would say, how is it that this generation can recognize when a storm is coming? We're pretty good at knowing the weather. We're all, it's going to be hot today. We recognize the change in the weather, but you don't recognize when the Son of Man is here. And you search the scriptures daily, seeking this eternal life, and here I am, and you don't recognize me. They accused Paul. Remember King Agrippa, he's before, Paul is before him, and he said, Paul, your great learning is driving you mad. You think you're going to convert this king? And Paul says, of course. And my paraphrase would be, he's not a stupid man, right? He's like, these things haven't escaped the king's view. So God expects us to reason this out. And sometimes we get distracted by the voices that are out there, but he says, I give you some common sense. You need to use it. So the second part is verse 32 and 33 from our text. 1 Kings 4:32 says, he spoke 3,000 proverbs. I don't know that we have them all penned. And his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts, and of birds and of reptiles and of fish. He had wisdom in all these matters and the ability to learn. So I love it. You know, you're out with people in their passion, whether it's gardening or just being out in nature and viewing the marvels of nature, and you meditate on it and you see God. If you don't see the Creator in that, you're missing something. So this is the second part, is this communication. That God gives all these things that we're studying in our Roman study, right? That God says, well, Paul says that man is without excuse because God made all this. How do you not? How are you not in awe of this? Because this creation. But when Stephen, right after the church begins, right, and Stephen goes out and he starts to preach, and the question came up in our study the other night: was Stephen aware that his speech was elevating and really getting to the point where he could sense that they were going to take his life? And I believe so. I believe in the way we were looking at this the other night in our lesson. We don't go out and shout on the street corner and invite a beating. A fool does that. We're to be wise. But at this particular point, because the question was, why did God strike down Ananias and Sapphira? Because they lied? Who doesn't lie? You ever wonder that when you read that? Because there was a purpose in that with God. We're not going to get into that story, but right, Stephen, he's telling the Jews about their history, bringing them, and he can tell that they're getting hot. Rather than hear what he's saying, they're getting to the point where they're ultimately going to kill him. But he says, and this is his communication, and we say, well, did he have to die for it? At this particular moment in human history, with the audience that he had, yes, for God's purpose. And Stephen understood it and willingly laid down his life, like Jesus did, for this communication, to communicate this message. It's that important. And so it's starting to culminate in Acts 7. I'll just read 50 through 53 because he says, you know, David prepared the work, but Solomon built the temple. But in verse 50 he said, really God, it's all God's. And he says, he quotes, he says, did not my hand make all these things? You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in your heart and your ears. You always resist the Holy Spirit. As your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered. You who received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it. Because had they kept the law, they would have recognized the Son. But here's the problem of us being taught when we're not seeking and we're not ready to learn. They're only hearing rebellion. It's like, you're attacking me. I can't tolerate this anymore. So their passion got so much that they stoned him to death. But the communication had to be there. And during Solomon's time, it says it's a peaceful time because his wisdom. Remember, wisdom turns, a wise counsel can turn away wrath. Not all the time. Because many times I wonder if this, when he asked that question the other night, I wonder if he was thinking, well, remember Jesus was speaking in the crowd and then he kind of disappears. And I wonder if Stephen thought, well, God could do that. Kind of like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? They said, we're not going to bow down to that image. God would save us. But even if he doesn't, and I was thinking that's probably Stephen, he could get me out of this. But even if he doesn't, I'm okay with that. Paul tells us where we are in Romans chapter 8:17. He says, and if then children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with him in order that we also may be glorified with him. So that's the gospel message, is to communicate this wisdom from God, this common sense that when he comes, we should be able to recognize him if we're seeking, if we have that kind of a heart. And so the last part of this is the charity. So we have this common sense, this communication, and then this charity. And I was thinking of this as kind of, I don't know if you ever think of this, but we hear these terms nowadays. Have you ever wondered about this? Who's got the patent on this? Because right now we're concerned with intellectual property, right? And God in his charity gives this. He didn't give this wisdom to Solomon for Solomon to gloat about it. He gave it to share and freely share. And so verse 34 of our text, 1 Kings 4:34 says, and the people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. They came and he gave. You know, the problem is with us a lot of times is we don't want to share what we know because we think it will threaten us. A lot of times we see it in the workplace, right? There are people that feel like they elevate themselves when they put others down. A lot of the times we say that's insecurity, right? We don't want to share what we have because we're insecure. If we give it, then somebody else will profit on and we'll be left behind. But again, in Isaiah, this is Isaiah chapter 33, and is probably the whole chapter, but it's another judgment scene. But in the midst of that, in Isaiah 33, 5 and 6, we see the Lord is exalted, for he dwells on high. He will fill Zion with justice and righteousness, and he will be the stability of your times. Abundance of salvation, wisdom, and knowledge. The fear of the Lord is Zion's treasure. So when we go to the source, where there's no patent on this intellectual property, it's God who freely gives it and marvels, I guess, when we don't accept it. And so, again, the Proverbs 16:20, whoever gives thought to the word will discover good, and blessed is he who trusts in the Lord. Proverbs 19:8 says, whoever gets sense loves his own soul. He who keeps understanding will discover good. So these are the wise sayings. And like I said, the challenge for us is, do we seek it out? Proverbs 25:2 says, listen, it's the glory of God to conceal things, but it's the glory of kings to search it out. So as I said, we love the treasure hunt. We love getting the map, and we love getting on the journey. And that's why I say when we get to a point in our life where we say, you know what, I want answers that make sense, and I have a heart that's seeking. And I get to where our workshop was last week at the retreat, where he says, in the beginning, God. If I could just get my mind around that. And we were admonished to think of not in the beginning Genesis, but to think about the author, the one who's behind it. Solomon says, it's the glory of God to conceal things. We say, why? How many times did they ask Jesus, it's in the Gospel of John many times, Jesus, just tell us plainly, why are you keeping us in suspense? And I'm thinking, by the time you read that, you're like, what has he not done? I mean, they just have ears that won't hear. And so Jesus gives many of these kind of examples for us, but here's just a few. in Matthew 13, there's a couple familiar ones, 13:44 through 46, where Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. I know we've had experiences in our life like this. Like, we had that song, one man gathers what another man spills. One man's waste is another's treasure. Again, I like this one. We call it the pearl of great price. Matthew 13:45. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all that he had and bought it. And God blesses us when we get on this path. Like I said, I've told you guys this many times. I go through these cycles in my life, like we all do. I have my good times and bad times. I get down. And so many times in my life I got to this point, it's like, can I ever be happy again? Can I ever find joy? Sometimes we get that way. And I've always marveled that God finds a way to give me this Christmas morning feeling. I never could do that. When I went to Lubbock, I never thought that it would take me the places that I've been, that I would travel and see I'll be talking with my mom, and she's like, "Oh my goodness, you've been to so many places." And one day I'd like to just put, I did, when I was traveling a lot, I did a diary. I diaried a lot of stuff, and I have all these pictures, Claudia. I have all these pictures of all, and I just want to put like a timeline together, because I remember when I was spending time with my dad, I would put, it's wonderful. You could pull up any place my dad's ever been. I could pull up on YouTube and play a video from it. Because he went to places I didn't go. He was in Switzerland. He got to go to Mammoth Mountain. I've never been there out in California. But I could pull it up and see scenes. So our friends, Bill and Kathy, they're at the Grand Canyon right now from our Wednesday afternoon group. And I just remember when I was traveling through there, I would click on my video, right, and take video of it, thinking, one day I'll reminisce about this. But then I found on YouTube there are other people that had the same idea with much better equipment. And I could enjoy theirs in 4K or whatever. And so there really hasn't been anything that I haven't been through or driven through or gone through, like the Bat Cave in New Mexico, Carlsbad Caverns, all these different places. God gives us such joy in fellowship. You have no idea where this is leading to. And then opportunities that come up. Joseph was here last night at our bar. I finally got to meet up with him. He came from Montana, and I've been trying to get a time, and he finally, he could come. I went and picked him up, and I had a great time with him. He might get a job in Hartford, and if he does, he'll stay. But right now, he's just only here for 7 more weeks on his internship. But who knows? And I was just talking to him how exciting it is. Listen, this lesson gets summed up in this. I had put it in the sense of wisdom. You have this common sense, this communication, and charity. That was basically the task of Solomon. You got this wisdom. Now put it out there. And not so much like Jeremiah. Because Jeremiah, go tell them this and they're not going to hear. But we could sum the lesson up like this from the New Testament and all that Jesus gives us. It's faith, hope, and love. The wisdom of God gives us this common sense, the ability to communicate it and share it freely. That's faith, hope, and love. And that's our lesson for today.
$684. This world is not my home.